Good afternoon. Hello, folks. My name is Chris Stevens. I'm Director of Communications with the Center for a Livable Future. A lot of friendly faces out there. It's my pleasure today to introduce Robert Gottlieb as our speaker. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Robert, and then we'll get underway. He's a professor of urban and environmental policy and director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute at Occidental College. He is the author and co-author of 12 books, including Food Justice, which he'll talk about today. He co-authored that with UEPI staff member, how do you pronounce her name? Anupama Joshi. Anupama Joshi. And Reinventing Los Angeles, Nature and Community in the Global City. The Next Los Angeles, The Struggle for a Livable City. He co-authored that with 3 staff members. And The Transformation of an American Environmental Movement and Environmentalism Unbound, Exploring New Pathways for Change. He's also the editor of 2 MIT Press series, Urban and Industrial Environments and Food, Health, and Environment. Professor Gottlieb is a co-chair of the Occidental College of Civic Engagement Initiative, and he has a long history in researching and participating in social movements, and he'll enlighten us on that today. I also want to thank Jesse Kurtz-Nicole, who was one of our research assistants and has a tie to Bob in getting Bob here today. We started talking about this event, I think it was like last November, October, and we kept going back and forth on dates and finally found a good date. So thanks to Jesse, he's now doing some research in Guatemala, and he left us last week. You can read about Bob's book, Jesse's take on it, on our blog, the Livable Future blog. And after the talk today, there's going to be a book signing and food out in the food court. So that's something to look forward to. Also, later on tonight at 6:30 at St. Matthew Catholic Church, there's some flyers out there, but Bob's going to be talking about farm worker justice. So it was RSVP by the other day, but I'm sure if you sweet talk some folks and you want to go out and hear it, you can get in. Bob?
I'll see if I need to have that light dimmed. I tend to be a wanderer, but I'm going to be strict and focused and not wander, since that's my instructions. But I bring greetings from Los Angeles. It's especially nice to bring greetings from Los Angeles because 2 of my former students are here in the audience. Actually, last night I gave a talk in D.C. At Bread for the City, and another one of my former students was there last night. So it feels like I'm coming home as well. What I thought I'd do is share with you a little bit about how I got myself engaged in food issues, and what work we do in the Urban Environmental Policy Institute, and then kind of situate the Food Justice book in that context. And then really, hopefully we can have some dialogue. We can have some discussions and really explore things that you'd be interested in. I actually got, my background was a lot more in the environmental movement than in the food justice movement. Back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. And in 1992, I was at UCLA, supervising a group of students who were doing their senior project, or actually a graduate master's project. And they wanted to do some work that would look at environmental justice issues in South LA. And they decided they wanted to focus on how those issues were experienced in a particular community, in a particular neighborhood, while at the same time looking at some of the broader issues, whether it was in terms of transportation or hazardous facilities, sort of some of the classic environmental justice questions. And it was an important moment in time for myself. I was working on a book at the furiously trying to finish it while working with my students and supervising this project. The book was called Forcing the Spring, and it was actually an environmental justice interpretation of the history of the environmental movement, using the lens of environmental justice characterizes the environment as where we live, work, and play, to use that oft-used slogan, but thinking about that, how that was also historically rooted, even though those were not movements that called themselves environmental, dealing with occupational hazards, dealing with issues of housing, dealing with issues of the kind of neighborhood scale problems that took place through the late 19th into the 20th century. So thinking about, it was very much on my mind when the students decided that they would begin work by talking to neighborhood groups about what made most sense for their research work. And in the summer, in late May, when they started in 1992, the riots happened in LA. A very powerful event that just transformed the city. It laid bare some of the questions that had never been resolved, the gaps, income, housing, transportation, the kind of range of daily life conditions were really exposed in the course of those five days. And so the students said, we need to kind of step back, and we don't need to assume that somehow environment is the core issue that the community folks that we've been dealing with will want us to focus. So they went back to the drawing boards and they started another round of talking to people in the community, church groups, community groups. And the answer they got at the end of the summer was this interest in food. And when you think in retrospect why that's the case, it makes, of course, a lot of sense. You had already, by the early 90s, that wholesale abandonment of supermarkets, of full-service food markets from the urban core areas like South LA. There were no supermarkets close by the particular neighborhood that the students were focused on. There was, on the other hand, a lot of corner stores that at that point in time really were part of kind of the liquor store bombardment that was taking place in places like South LA, calling themselves food stores because they sold junk food and candy and cigarettes and liquor, of course. It was also where you had the explosion of fast food in that community as well. Of course, in all communities, but particularly so in South LA, you could find fast food restaurants on every block. And there was also interest by those groups in the idea of having alternative ways to access food, farmers markets, community gardens, which were, ironically enough, strategies that had developed in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, as strategies for healthy food, fresh food access in those communities that was also affordable food. And the earliest farmers markets in LA in this period of the late 1970s when they were revived, and this is true in many other cities, it wasn't just an LA phenomenon, were low-income farmers markets. And by 1992, and similarly today, farmers markets are now really associated with kind of a middle-class phenomenon for good reason. Farmers markets are wonderful institutions, powerful institutions in terms of urban space and community meeting grounds. But for a number of reasons, they had been not so much abandoned in low-income communities, but the ones that had been set up kind of were struggling to survive. fewer farmers, other kinds of concerns that had developed around the low-income market. So the students were getting feedback, how can we revive these fresh food access strategies in our community? So they gathered together and they came back to me and they said, we want to do a food project. We want to do a systems analysis. We want to look at the food system and we want to see how it's experienced in that community. And that was a moment for me because there I was busy working away at trying to do this book on the kind of a reinterpretation of what the environmental movement was all about. And it just made sense. Food, of course, was also an environmental issue. It is where we live, where we work, where we play, where we eat, how we eat, what we eat. And it was a way in which part of the argument for me around environmental justice really translated to an argument that we now have embraced around food justice, that it's a connected issue, that it's not just in a narrow sphere of environment or of food, but it deals with conditions of daily life in communities, as well as the kind of broader system frame that one needs to examine when thinking about how food is experienced in particular communities. So I became an early foodie, if you will, and some of the projects that we developed were really connected to linking these questions of environment to food and to a range of other issues. Tell you one other story that really reinforced my interest that was personal based. Jump ahead a few years later, around 1995, 96, and we were looking at, from this argument about farmers markets, we worked with one of the associations in Southern California, the Southland Farmers Market Association, now unfortunately defunct, about how would one support farmers markets, thinking particularly in terms of access to low-income residents. And we played around with a number of different models. We created kind of a quasi-CSA concept, a market basket concept, and we weren't getting very far with it. And at that point, my daughter, the same daughter who Jesse Kurtz-Nickel taught social studies in Santa Monica High School, which was a connection I had to CLF, goes back to that period. My daughter, then in elementary school, said to me one day that, you know, the food that they got in the cafeteria in the school that she went, which was a mixed income school, had about 50% free and reduced lunch kids at the school, predominantly Latino, that there wasn't really healthy food, fresh food especially, which she, of course, had, or not so, of course, but she had come with me to farmers markets, and she had come to embrace having that kind of food. And she said, you know, it's not what we're getting in the cafeteria. We're getting this kind of wilted lettuce and fruit that's really kind of in this jellied sauce for the pineapple, and it's just, you know, what are you doing? You're a big food advocate. Why can't you even change our local school? And that was sort of my second epiphany, if you will, around food, which was that you could really think about it in places like schools, and you could make that connection of why not get the farmers market hooked into the schools. And this was 1995-96. When we came up with that concept, we went to the school food service folks and to the superintendent of my daughter's school district, and the food service director was a man named Rodney Taylor, who had been in the food industry for a long time, the food service industry specifically, but even prior to that, he had done work in the food industry. A very skeptical guy who thought, he tells the story and I tell the story, he has his version, I have my version. And you can go to YouTube, and we just had an event together where we told our respective versions, and you can hear his version. His version is oh, here's another rich white parent with too much time on his hands coming to tell me what I should do with my school food service business. And my version was, here's this conservative food service director who just won't be willing to do any kind of innovation, but we'll out-organize him. We'll get the folks engaged, the parents, the kids. We had a school garden at the school. We'll get the kids to think about what the garden means to them in terms of the kind of food they would like to have in the cafeteria. So ultimately, what happened is that he agreed to a test, a week-long test in the summer, to see what would happen if he did. We had an offer to serve system, and you could have a choice between what we call the hot meal versus the salad bar meal, and with coming directly from the farmers market, several farmers from the farmers market who supplied the salad bar. And Rodney would say he was convinced that he would make sure that this test failed by offering pizza on the first day. And as he tells the story, that first day came around, and when 75% of the kids went to the salad bar, after we had organized and worked with parents and talked about how to shape and organize the environment of this around the salad bar, and it also passed the message on to the kids that this was a true salad bar. They could take what they wanted. They had some control over what it meant to eat the food that they wanted to select. 75% of the kids did choose the salad bar. And the way Rodney tells the story, he became, it was a moment for him to really redefine what he was about. And that he saw his work, he changed the name of food service to the Food and Nutrition Service. He became what we today in our book call a food justice champion. He's a very powerful figure going around the country talking about farm to school, talking the language of food service directors would understand about why this mission change is so important to him, was so important to him personally, but of course it's so important to what would happen for the kids who came to the schools and for the farmers who supplied the food for the school lunch program. So that was the origins of Farm to School. At that point in time, Farm to School was only in 2 other school districts, one in Florida and one in North Carolina. Both of them were really oriented towards the farm side of the equation. We argued it had to be a farm and K-12 equation, that you had to link both sides. And that really led to the development of the work that we were doing, thinking about organizing, thinking about program work, thinking about the research that would go into evaluating these kinds of initiatives, and a range of other kind of policy and program development work that became part of our signature, which we've continued to do now since that point in time, and since 1997, since I've been over at Occidental College, where we've created this institute that functions both in relation to program policy organizing on the one hand and an education and research center on the other. We have a number of programs that look at these issues of how to transform the way we both access our food and how it's produced, and how that also connects to a range of other social justice issues that are part of the work we do as well, whether it's affordable housing or transportation issues, or what goes on within the school day for school-age children. One of our programs, for example, is Farm to Preschool. That's just developed, partly because we see from our own research, and particularly others who have done this research, that we are circulating as significant, that your weight gain and even obesity levels in the 0 to 5 population has become one of the new types of epidemics that we're witnessing, and which is in some ways the most serious change that's taking place, because when you see that kind of weight gain change take place with that population, the potential for that being a lifelong set of health outcomes is that much greater. And on the other hand, the idea of changing the way preschoolers relate to food creates a constituency for thinking about, as you go into the K-12 system and beyond, how to approach food differently. So part of the farm to preschool concept is not so much how much food you get from local farms or regional farms into the child care and preschool programs, but how the kids also respond to that food, whether it's through a garden, whether it's through tastings, whether it's going out to the farm, whether it's through kind of early childhood curricula development. Those kinds of ways are significant as well. So that's what we do, and food justice became very much the governing metaphor of the work we do, because it did tie into a number of other kinds of initiatives that we were working on outside the food area. And we, in fact, all our food programs got lumped into what we called the Center for Food and Justice, which was one wing of the Urban Environmental Policy Institute. But when Anupam and I sat down about 3 years ago and said, well, let's, in fact, this notion of food justice is starting to resonate. It's being used increasingly by a number of different groups. But it's unformed really as a coherent, well-developed, well-defined strategy and approach. Very much the way, for example, 15 years earlier, community food security emerged as a term to identify kind of an alternative way that would link the production side to the consumption side. But food justice, even more so, really captured the notion that food was an issue that translated into so many other domains. So we thought, well, let's pull this together and particularly look at things that were going on around the country that really articulated this alternative approach, and also provide a kind of a template for the work that had already been developed that identified what those food systems issues were. If you went through from growing and producing food and the processing industries that had developed, the retail side, the transformation around from eating in to eating out, the consumption side, how you could in fact establish a systems perspective, but then frame it in relation to the kind of food justice work going on the ground, on the ground that was seeking at different entry points to make changes to that system. And that became our food justice book. Half analysis, kind of the walk through what we call the long march through the institutions, the walk through the different parts of the food system and how they link to each other, and what the kinds of problems that have been identified that could be seen a kind of a single walk-through document. And then the second half of the book, we wanted to tell some stories, a narrative of food justice that was happening around the country, whether it was new farming initiatives, whether it was mobilization of farm workers, of food processing workers, of restaurant workers, sort of the worker justice component of food justice, whether it was community scale organizing that was going on where, for example, the group that's this young community gardeners in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Puerto Rican, one of the earliest of the food justice groups, Nuestras Raíces, mobilized and really expanded their focus beyond the community garden insight they had initially, which had a whole range of goals associated with it, to being a social justice player, dealing with questions of food and environment and economic justice issues in Western Massachusetts and in Holyoke. So we wanted to tell community stories. We wanted to tell stories of people like Rodney Taylor and the different kind of farm-to-school initiatives. We wanted to tell stories, and unfortunately when we wrote the book we didn't tell the Baltimore story, but of the kind of new policy initiatives, particularly the food policy councils, that were re-emerging in 2008, 2009. There'd been an earlier wave of them, including one in LA in the mid-90s, some had survived, but a lot of them had kind of dissipated, and there was a new revival and really an explosion of food policy councils that developed in the last few years. And I'm giving talks around the country, and each place I go to, either a food policy council has been set up or is in the process of being set up. And I gave a talk yesterday in D.C. They want to form a food policy council. Montgomery County advocate came up to me and said, well, we want to form a food policy council. And I said, go talk to Holly in Baltimore. She'll tell you what the interesting new models are that Baltimore is in the lead of creating. And we've set one up in LA again as well, that's much stronger than the one in the mid-90s. And part of the reason it's much stronger is that the food movement itself, and within that the food justice frame, is so much stronger. So I don't know how much time I've gone on. We're good? Okay. Let me just tell a couple of the stories that really relate to the places I've been and Anupama has been in the last 3, 4, 5 months, and kind of situate for us what that has meant, and then we can hopefully have some dialogue. And so 2 stories. First story, in October, the book came out, end of October, and our first event, one of the first events was in New Orleans. It was the occasion that brought both Anupam and I to New Orleans, was the annual meeting of the Community Food Security Coalition meeting. But the event we decided to kind of launch this food justice book tour, if you will, was with a group that we profile in the book called the Rethinkers. And the Rethinkers are middle school kids who mobilized after Katrina in 2006 to try and deal with what was going on in the schools in New Orleans, which were horrendous pre-Katrina and uninhabitable post-Katrina. So they wanted to just kind of walk through the schools, all the issues, and so they talked about bathrooms not working, or the deterioration of the physical plant, the absence of any true textbooks, the overloaded classes because some of the schools couldn't reopen, just the range of things that made middle school and high school and elementary schools so unbearable. And they picked out, each summer they decided they would pick out an issue to focus on. They worked with some folks who helped them both how to get the attention of the school district and the media, and the kind of the players in the field who could work with them. And the third year, they got together in the summer. They decided they wanted to deal with school food. And they brought in one of the wonderful New Orleans food organizations, food justice organizations. They started learning about regional food. They went out and visited the Shrimpers in Grand Isle, but then found out that that wasn't what was going into their lunchroom. The shrimp was this iconic New Orleans local food, was not being sourced in the school cafeteria. They focused a lot on the environment of school food, really a crucial issue. If you're thinking about farm to school, you don't want to separate the environment in which the lunch period is defined, if you will. So is the long lines, the short lunch period, the way the cafeteria looked, even the dinnerware. Their symbol was the spork, the fork, plastic fork on one side and the spoon on the other side. And so they would do the clenched spork. We need a change in our school food environment. And Farm to School was part of it, School Gardens was part of it, and they mobilized. And they got the media attention, they got the attention of the school district, and they brought about some change. And Anupam and I first encountered them a year later when they gave a presentation in Portland at a Farm to Cafeteria conference, a Farm to School, Farm to Institution conference. And these middle school kids got up and told their story. And it blew us away, it blew everybody who was in attendance away. The idea of possibility was so embedded in the fact that middle school kids mobilized to change their school food environment. And we identified them as food justice champions. And so we had an event in New Orleans with them. HBO cameras were following them around. They were going to do a documentary on youth changing the way of what was happening around food. And so they were going to lead the documentary. It's probably going to be airing in the next month or so with the Rethinkers, so they had followed the Rethinkers around. One of their champions was now first year in high school, but they allowed her to stay part of the community of Rethinkers. New middle school kids had become part of it. They continued to do work around food. They decided this was an issue that really mobilized them and mobilized the kids they were talking to. It's not that they were not concerned about other school issues, but food really remained central to them. So they continued to mobilize around food, and they brought members of the community came. It was at a community books center, bookstore in New Orleans. It's just a wonderful event. They told their story again, and we told about how we connected to their story. And then we ended the event with asking them to sign the book with us when people wanted to get the book. If I only could bring the Rethinkers here to Baltimore, I'd have them sign the book here, but maybe we'll have some of our Baltimore food justice champions do that. And because it was their book, that was really part of our message of saying that this is an emerging movement that is extending deep roots in multiple places and amongst multiple constituencies. So that's story one. Story two, and then I'll wrap up, was an event we did in the Salinas Valley in California. And in also one that was connected in Silicon Valley. We tooled around with a group called ALBA, which is an organization that has actually been around for a number of years. It had an earlier name called the Rural Development Center. And its goal in those 30 years, with a land base that they had established in the Salinas Valley, was how there can be a pathway for farm workers to become farmers. Almost all immigrant. So they've been also involved with groups like the National Immigrant Farming Initiative. And they have great stories to tell about the new farmers that are part of the ALBA community. And they are also kind of leading in what is called the kind of regional food hub model, where ALBA itself functions as a kind of a mini food hub where they get all the farmers to work through them to aggregate the food and bring it out and distribute it to different suppliers. So we did several events with ALBA, and one of the events that I brought them along was at Google. it turned out another of our former students at Occidental now works at Google, and she's a foodie, and she set up a talk, and then subsequently I met with the head chef and the food buyer at Google. For those of you who don't know about how Google connects to food, they have a really quite extraordinary food program where they source within as much as they can. They said they now source 30% of fruits and vegetables, 70% of the range of products that they have as part of their the food that they offer for Google employees within a 200-mile radius. And Alba is their biggest supplier amongst local farm suppliers. They also go through a couple of wonderful distributors as well who are working with local farmers. And Google offers the food for free. They have little kind of health indices of, you know, is this gluten-free and does this have salt and sugar? And but the core argument is we want to get local fresh food. We want to really emphasize healthy food. And it's a big operation, as you would think. And in fact, what Google does is really, leaving aside the fact that the food is free, but it's in its bubble, the Google bubble, it demonstrates how to, in fact, create an alternative food system. So we had an interesting exchange. On the one hand, this wonderful opportunity with Alba and some of the other local farmers to have an important place where they could sell their product. For the Google employees, it was a great strategy. The food was there all day. It became an incentive because it was free. It was kind of a worker productivity strategy. You'd stay, you could take the food home to your family, maximize that productivity. So that clearly was the goal. But we said to Google, to the Google folks, you can't just think about what you're doing in a bubble. You need to think about the role you can play to begin with, in the communities around which you operate, many of which are food insecure and don't have fresh sources of food. And also in terms of the larger transformation that's taking place. I just got an email today from the health department in Santa Clara County saying, can't you get Google connected to us because there are things that we need in terms of work that we're trying to do around agricultural land that Google could help. So it becomes part of how you bring about change, that long march through the institutions, to go to the Googles of the world and say that you need to apply your resources, your connections, your capacity to bring about a change across the board. It's not just a Google employee issue and a worker productivity issue. It's the social place that everybody is connected with, and has to become part of how you define your own role. The answer has not yet been determined, but that's part of what I would consider the struggle of going through and making the changes that can take place at every level, in every setting, and whether it's at the policy front, because we have food policy councils, whether it's at the program, innovation way of bringing about food justice change, such as farm to school, or regional food hubs, whether it's at the level of mobilization of the different people who are impacted by the food system, whether it's the community groups, the NGOs, the workers at different levels, of the food system who have begun to mobilize. Kathy Ozer from the National Family Farm Coalition was at the meeting last night, and someone asked about farmers who kind of the middle player farmers, the corn and soybean growers, and sort of challenging that they could be part of the food movement. She told a wonderful story. She said, you know, it is a struggle. You got to really change the conditions on the ground in which they can operate to get them off the subsidy system, but you've got to bring about food system change if you're doing that. And then she ended by saying, you know, those people that drove the tractors in Madison and the protests that are going on at the state capitol around the issues of disempowering workers, state workers, public workers in Madison, those tractors were driven by the farmers who are now really a central part of the food movement. Trying to think about how to change conditions on the ground in terms of way and how they farm. So it's an issue that's about changing the nature of farming. And then finally, and maybe this is also important to think about in a context of coming here to campus, what I've found in these talks and being part of the food movement for a long time is that the demography is changing in a special way. That today I would argue that the food movement, and particularly the food justice movement, is also a youth movement. And that's an extraordinary change, because a youth movement creates the capacity to believe that change is possible. To use the slogan of Paris, France, 1968, be realistic, demand the impossible. And that's really, I think, the slogan of a youth-led food justice movement that's asking nothing less than demanding the impossible in a context of having to be realistic about why that change and those changes have to take place. So I'll end with that.
At the beginning, and I'll get in trouble from those guys back there. We're videotaping this, so if you have a question, wait for the microphone, and Becca or yours truly will give you a microphone. Questions? No questions?
Speechless.
There's one. Holly?
So from a policy perspective, when you're looking at the schools, do you think that, and I'm not sure if this is still true, so correct me if I'm wrong, that do you have a policy in the schools about a garden in every school? And if you do, has that influenced the cafeteria, farm-to-school cafeterias in the schools?
Yes and no. Actually, the garden in every school was a policy put forth in the late 1990s by Delane Easton when she was the head of the education in the state. And she had a staff person, Ann Evans, who was a garden champion. But there was no, and we did a study at that point in time when soon after that policy was established, but it was a policy without any resources to implement and any follow-through for implementation. So we did a study in the Los Angeles Unified School District, which has, Alex, you can correct me, but that's something like 400 schools or more probably. But it's the second largest school district, and we found actually that 50% of the schools had either active gardens or gardens that had been recently gone under, mostly that were still active. But there was no continuity. They were, existing on a thread largely because a parent or a teacher had come into play to make sure that it could happen. There were no resources. There was no follow-through at that time. So it was a policy without any implementation. So it's been since then really ad hoc. It's depended school district by school district. There are now some funds that make school gardens possible. So school gardens are definitely very much part of thinking about the cafeteria, that you make that connection between garden and cafeteria, but it's an ad hoc framework in terms of how gardens survive and what they develop, with some exceptions in particular school districts where there's stronger support or there is a little bit of federal funding that has come through in the past. Who knows where it'll be after tomorrow. But the link between getting the garden food into the cafeteria, which I think you were going for in the question, is more challenging. And there's a lot of resistance to that for a number of reasons, some of which really aren't really relevant, but they still guide school food service policy. So the way we've worked on trying to get around it is to do things like this concept of Harvest of the Month, getting kids connected to the garden food and seeing that it ought to be connected to the food in the cafeteria, the same type of food. And the Farm to School Network, the National Farm to School Network, highlights significantly school gardens as part of the strategy. And there's a new program that just is rolling out that we helped incubate. It's now on its own. It's an AmeriCorps program called Food Corps. And the deadline is Sunday. If you want to be a Food Corps member, which is to create school garden and farm to school programs around the country. There are, I forget the number of sites, but there are a number of sites that have been identified. It's the first year of the program. Hopefully next year it's going to expand further, although, again, AmeriCorps is in the target of some of our food injustice champions in Congress who don't think it's such a good idea to have young people going out and doing AmeriCorps-type work. Maybe they'll end up voting, too. Yes, there is that connection is really an important one.
First, I want to thank you for your remarks. And my name is Ed McNeil. I'm the director of the Franciscan Center. And one of the areas that you talked about, especially as you got into how you came in to this, is very similar to what we do in terms of, you talked about the food deserts in South Los Angeles and the flight of supermarkets and food from the urban environment, and that's certainly our experience being an agency that provides direct service to the poor through a pantry and a dining room as well as other services. I was excited to hear that you see it as a youth movement now, a youth-led movement, especially with the New Orleans middle school kids and things like that, and also young adults, which has been our experience too. For example, campus kitchens and things like that. Do you see it as becoming, from a justice point of view, a self-interested or an other-interested movement? Has it gotten to the point where it's a wider community, or is it still in the Google, this is good for us, and we really
Great
need
question.
to be pushed?
Yeah. So let me answer it in two ways. First, just in terms of the role of the kind of the emergency food system universe. One of the really interesting things that we wrote a little bit about in the book, but we really could be an area to expand significantly. And when I gave a talk in Tucson, it was sponsored by the Tucson Food Bank. When I gave a talk yesterday in D.C. in the evening, it was Bread for the City that hosted it. And a couple of things on those events. They were predominantly the people working in those entities were young people, as you point out, and also they were really exploring strategies that really reorient the way you think about the kind of connections that a food bank system could provide. Those are the growing entities because of the severe crisis we have in terms of food insecurity and the huge income gap that takes place. And so like the Bread for the City is going to do a rooftop garden. They're thinking about other kind of food-connected work that they want to do that takes it outside of the kind of emergency food framework. And we've talked with some folks about how the infrastructure of the emergency food system could be used in connection to things like regional food hubs, where you've got the kind of a delivery infrastructure that could be established, the warehousing infrastructure. So there are lots of interesting things going on in terms of making that connection, much more than even 2 years ago when we sat down and discussed a little bit about anti-hunger strategies and what was going on in that world. The other part of your question, remind me, was the other directed, and yes, great question, because that's really one of the purposes of doing the food justice book. And it was similar, it resonated for me also thinking about what was the purpose of that book in 1992 when I was writing Forcing the Spring, and the argument about environmental justice in the context of the environmental movement. Really parallel. The environmental justice movement really answered the question, is the environmental movement really about me and about, kind of protecting the environment as a kind of a middle-class amenity, which it suffered from. The environmental movement really suffered from that. And a lot of other social justice groups were reluctant to make the connection to the environmental movement. They saw it as a kind of not in my backyard, but very specifically not in my middle-class backyard. And environmental justice changed the discourse. It really said environment is everywhere, and it's really redefining what the environmental movement has to be about. And it had a big impact on the environmental movement. It's not 100% impact, but it did. Yesterday's talk I gave at UDC was also about environmental justice, and there's an environmental justice coordinator in the Sierra Club, and she talked about the different programs, including ones here in Chesapeake Bay, that were really important for the Sierra Club to make that leap. Well, that's the same when we talk about the food movement. The food movement suffers from the idea that it's really about a very limited kind of amenity, getting even the term locavore kind of signifies that it's local for me, that I can have, access to good food because I can pay for it, and the farmers markets are in my neighborhood, and I'm really concerned about healthy food. And similar to the environmental movement, what the food movement is raising are good things. We want farmers markets. We want local food. But it loses its power, its strength, when it seems to be really oriented towards, a small segment of the population. And so food justice changes the discourse, changes the equation. It says food and I left that out in the talk, we have a definition of food justice, which we say food justice is really about systems issues, first of all, which affects everybody. Obesity affects everybody because diets have changed. So you do want to change diet. But you have to talk about who are the most vulnerable, who are the people who are lacking the access, who are the most at stake in terms of these outcomes around obesity, because they have the highest obesity rates, the highest incidence of type 2 diabetes, et cetera. So you have to talk about injustice, disparities, who is most vulnerable, and the advocacy, whether it's people in the fields, the workforce, whether it's the people in communities, whether it's defined by income gaps. You've got to address the issue of who is most vulnerable as part of the argument of the food movement. And then the third part of the definition is that you can't separate those issues from a range of economic justice issues, housing justice issues, transportation justice issues, environmental justice issues. There was a wonderful comment by the Bread for the City person last night where he argued, what's our advocacy? It has to be living wage. We have to deal with the fact, whether it's because food stamps, whether it's in terms of lack of jobs, whether it's in terms of low-wage sectors, that's what's driving the problem. So that you really need to be focused as an economic justice advocate when you're a food justice advocate, when you're a food movement advocate. You can't make that separation. And I think it's resonating. I think the food movement has gone a long way to thinking about, long way or short way. I mean, it's not been very long where this concept is starting to resonate, and people are starting to use the justice language in talking about food advocacy. But I think we still have a ways to go. And there is always going to be that comment, I won't say who made it, but it caused a raging debate in ComFood, the listserv of the Community Food Security Coalition, when someone, nameless, said, well, you know, the problem is the people who purchase that extra pair of Nike shoes, and rather than thinking about purchasing for more money healthy food at the farmer's market. Well, that's an argument that's not going to resonate. That's not how you frame the issue. You frame the issue by, as that the very same person said 10 years earlier when she came down and visited one of the first farm-to-school programs, said, why, this is as good a salad as in those high-priced restaurants. And that's the argument. Those 50% free and reduced kids are going to eat the best salad there is out there, and get to connect with it. So yes, it's obviously other-directed, but it's also about changes that happen with us, but the changes that would happen with us are not separate from the changes that have to be made system-wide.
We have time for one more quick question, if there is one.
Thank you for your talk. I was just curious what, in collecting all these stories, if you came across specifically public health, either agencies or individual practitioners who were involved in the movement, or where you see opportunities for the contribution of public health to this.
You know, one of the earliest food policy councils was in Toronto in the mid-90s. They got early 90s, they really started. And their genius in setting up that food policy council was to link it to the arguments around health, and also to be located in their public health department. And they still survive, and there are a number of reasons why they've still survived, and they're still going strong. The health argument around food is really central, and it's become increasingly so, and that's been part of the way the food movement itself has become, been able to articulate a message that reaches a number of groups that hadn't been reached before. You also have health institutions now playing an important role, whether they're foundations or they're health institutions like Kaiser Permanente, which has really stepped up in terms of what they're doing in relation to not just funding, but using their own system to encourage change to take place, farmers markets on hospital grounds, for example. And then in the schools, I think you're seeing a change. I think the program you have here is really a model that ought to be taken on the road to every public health school in the country. I had a young woman came up to me yesterday's talk and said, I want to apply to public health school. Where should I go? I said, check it out here. You know, you've got things going on. It's your backyard. And then I gave her a couple of other schools I thought were doing a good job. But you know, there's also now the putting prevention to work programs that are located in health departments. So there are lots of opportunities, both in terms of the schools and in terms of the institutions, public and private, to make that shift. The biggest funder in California for food work is the California Endowment, which came about because of the Blue Cross Blue Shield merger, and they've sort of become one of the best of the progressive foundations funding food and some other programs, but food is really central. They actually have approached me about doing a program on soda tax, which they would like to maybe get engaged in, or at least informally get engaged in. One of their grantees has been the leading advocate in California for a soda tax. So yes, there are players out there in the public health world, students, programs like CLF, Kaiser, the Kaisers of the world, the California Endowments of the world, and health departments that are seeing a kind of a change of focus. LA is a good example of that. I don't know, I think that's true here in the Baltimore region as well. And that's a really important change. And I think it incredibly strengthens the food movement to be seen as a health justice movement as well, and vice versa.
Thank you, Bob. We have our own food justice out in the lobby here. And if you have any more questions, Bob will be out there along with copies of his book. Thanks again for coming.
My pleasure.